you all been at the Opera House?
Yes.
It's really kind of interesting because the theater was built, it's a strange V-shaped piece of property with the theater built in the middle and then two attached 6-story office buildings. And the reason for that was if the theater failed, you'd have rents from stores and offices to take care of your investment in the property. Now, and through the years, from the 20s all the way up into the 1970s, the building was really a one-stop everything because you had a women's clothing store, there was a Oriental rug store, we had doctor's offices, dentist offices, we had a violin maker, we had First by Roberts, had 2 floors in the building. Walsh College of Business was founded in the building in 1922 and stayed until 1970. The early beginnings of Wayne County Community College also began in that building. We had jewelers, we had a chiropractor, we had a cocktail lounge and a bookstore. So it was really one stop. You could come in less than a day, you could come and watch a movie if you wanted, or see a stage show, but you would also drink, eat, go to the doctor, get your back cracked, purchase things. It was amazing. But unfortunately, like everything else, by the 1970s, this sort of all went away. When we acquired the theater, little did we know that we'd also have to renovate the 2 office buildings. And that was a real challenge because there were no windows. There hadn't been any heat or electricity or anything for a number of years. First we tackled the theater, and then we tackled the two office buildings. The building facing Comerica Park on Madison, we put a cafe on the main floor, donor lounge on the 2nd level, and then the upper floors are administrative offices. The Broadway Street building became our educational center. So where the 2nd floor was a jeweler, that is now our resource center and library. The 3rd level is a costume shop. The 4th level is classrooms. The 5th level is dance studios. And then the 6th floor is a black box theater. And then we also went one step further, and the entire roof is an event center too. We do a lot of weddings up there and special events. So every square inch of the building is now designed to generate revenue. You know what that's like when you're a nonprofit. Okay, this is an image of Dr. David DeCara, who was our founder and saved not only this theater, but also saved Music Hall from becoming a parking lot, which is where the Michigan Opera Theater really got its start in 1970. This is Charles Howard Crane, the architect of the theater. He designed 50 theaters here in Detroit, 300 nationwide. The last theater he designed was, have you ever been to the Pines Theater up in Houghton Lake? You really need to check it out. It's probably the only theater in the country built out of fieldstone and pine logs. And you go inside and it's amber light. It's very orangey light. There are murals throughout the theater reflecting the North Country, and then there are over 100 stuffed animal heads scattered throughout the theater of all the types of animals that are indigenous to the North Country. It still has its original crier room as well. It's still family owned and operated, still first run. They had a digital a couple of years ago, so really, really cool place. But he got very frustrated because after the Depression, there were no commissions, the type of commissions that he was used to. So he moved to London and then designed a lot of industrial buildings in Europe, as well as Earl's Court, which, if you're familiar with that, it's a huge mixed-use facility that was built over 14 different railroad lines. This is John Kunske. John Kunske actually funded the building of our theater. He had started out on Monroe Street, between Woodward and Randolph, and owned a number of theaters on that block. Most of those were really our first theaters where movies were on school. And this is what the theater looked like in the 20s. I wish we could have that marquee again today, sort of a cantilever marquee. That's on our wish list. And this was our first music director, Edward Warner. After he got started with our orchestra, because when the theater opened, remember, movies were silent. So we had a 40-piece orchestra, the Capitol Wonder Orchestra, to accompany those silent pictures. Once talkies came in, then he moved over to the Michigan Theater. And this is his wife, Marguerite, who was our organist for a number of years. And she was pretty well known around the country as being one of the top organists. This is actually the second pipe organ that was put in our theater. The original pipe organ was a Hilgren Lane, but when Paramount Pictures took the theater over in 1929, they felt that didn't live up to their standards. So they had this Wurlitzer Publix One organ built for our theater, which later on, it was removed from the theater in 1957 and went to the old Arcadia roller rink on Woodward. And then by the 1970s was moved to the Paramount Theater in Oakland, California. This isn't the type of stage shows that would have been to augment the movies in the 20s and 30s. This is the Broadway side of the building, and this whole side of the building, when we acquired the theater in the late 1980s, had to end up going away for several years. We received a grant in 2000, I think it was, to restore that side of the theater, because the Broadway side is all terracotta. So terracotta is hardened clay with several layers of glaze over it with all this ornamentation. It's great in Miami and LA, but in our freeze-thaw cycle here, does not work. And so 4 years, the building had no HVAC. So a lot of this started to crack and fall off. So over the course of 2 years, Boston Valley Terracotta, upstate New York, would come with flatbed trucks and haul away this whole side of the building, recreate the columns, recreate the capitals, and all the ornamentation on the upper floors. Here's a closer view of it. Now, when it was the Capitol, too, we had an enormous blade sign with the Capitol up on top. Of course, this was all lit up. The signage on the left here, you can see where they would come out onto the roof. This was all hand-painted for every attraction at the theater. And we used to have really cool awnings, striped awnings above all of these windows. This is where our stage house is today. This, of course, all went away. Many years ago, there was the Dime Savings Bank had a branch here, and then this became a bridal studio. This is the Madison side of the theater. And this is in 1929 when Paramount Pictures acquired the theater. Paramount operated the theater from 1929 to 1934. The Depression sort of almost killed the business. Because you have to remember, this was at a time when the studios had a lot of power. They produced the movies, distributed the movies, put the movies in the buildings that they owned. Of course, the Fox was built by 20th Century Fox, United Artists by United Artists Studios. The Adams Theater was built with MGM money. So, but by the late 1940s, there was a government decree that it was too much of a monopoly. And so the studios had to divest themselves of their theaters. This was what the lobby looked like on Broadway in the 1920s. We've been very faithful to this lobby today. About the only thing missing is these large attraction boards here, and of course the brass rails. The box office today is very similar to the original box office. It's a combination of marble and plaster. And then several years ago, I took these images and then blueprints up to the costume shop so that they could make draperies with all the tassels and other accoutrement. This is what the auditorium looked like. Now originally, on the box level, it was all open. There were heavy drapes, brass rods all the way across for privacy. Today, of course, because we're a live performance venue, we've had to add walls and doors on this level, as well as the main floor. Main floor was pretty open. The only thing missing from, this is a 1920s view of the auditorium. We don't know what happened to the chandeliers that hung from the organ grills on both sides of the auditorium. This is the proscenium. The proscenium, there are about 25 panels all the way across. These all also had to be completely redone. And they depict art, industry, and commerce in Detroit in the early 1920s. Here's a better view of the stage. And you can see all of this plaster. Most of this plaster was on the floor when we acquired the theater. So the auditorium had 7 floors of scaffolding for an entire year to recreate all of this plaster. Here you see, these are large sunbursts all the way across. And then we have a whole series of catwalks above the ceiling, because there's another floor and a half above that. And Chris Richardson was our chief plaster restoration artist who came to us from Great Britain. And he had started out at Pinewood Studios. And for a number of years, he built all of the scale models for all of the 007 films. And then also did scale models for the early Indiana Jones films and also Superman. And so he had a crew of 25 plaster artists working on this for almost 2 years. Right now, he's finishing up a job in the book building, which will open up in early 2023. One of the challenges there was a huge, if you remember coming in off of Washington Boulevard, the original lobby was 3 stories high, beautiful plaster and all, but at some point in time in the 60s, it was all covered up with, cheap fake ceiling tiles. This is some of the melt glass that you'll see on the main floor. These are the boxes right below that. This was another challenge for Chris too, because there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rosettes in the ceiling, and those all had to be recreated too. And then we went into the decorative painting phase. These are the base of several of the torchieres on both sides of the stage. These also had to be completely renovated. This is a look up the grand staircase. One of the trademarks, of course, are our chandeliers. There are 3 large chandeliers in the grand lobby. The only time they've ever left the building was for restoration. During the 4 years of abandonment, they were simply too big and too difficult to steal. Several years ago, when we had film tax credits under a different governor, our costume shop made costumes for about a dozen movies, and then Warner Brothers came to town to shoot. I don't know if any of you saw it. It might not be, your cup of tea, but it was a $25 million production and put a lot of people to work. A very Harold and Kumar 3D Christmas. If you follow Harold and Kumar, first they went to White Castle, then they went to Guantanamo Bay, and then they came to Detroit to do a movie. That movie took place in New York City at Christmas time, but the entire film was shot here in Detroit in July. So our theater was surrounded by fake snow and Christmas decorations in July. The grand lobby here became a nightclub for Neil Patrick Harris. He is hallucinating and meets Jesus on top of our grand staircase. Then they went up north. The team from LA came in and chopped down about 15 gigantic Christmas trees for the stage, because then our stage became Radio City Music Hall with Neil Patrick Harris and the Rockettes. So it goes on. It was a lot of fun. The only thing missing from the lobby today there were beautiful oil paintings that Mr. Klinsky, who built the theater, had acquired on a European trip. We don't know what happened to those. Also the torchiers on the sides and also at the top of the stairs. We don't know what happened to those. You have to remember, this was a rock concert palace in the 80s, and a lot of things disappeared. The milk glass light fixtures, too, that adorn the theater, today it's a combination of original and repro. We actually had to go to Atlanta to an antique dealer who ended up with some of these and buy them back. I've also got, if you look at some of the things I brought, I've got one of the original exit plates I got on the table over here too, which is stained glass. This is on the second level, going into the donor lounge. Today, this opens up into an addition to the building, so we could put an elevator in, because the theater never had an elevator for patrons. So those were challenges. Elevators and restrooms are big challenges to get this theater reopened, because even though when it was a movie house, you know, it had almost 3,000 seats, over 3,000 seats, there were only 12 toilets in this theater. Now we've gone to 120.
During rock concert, beer probably being served.
But these theaters were built at a time when there was no concession. You know, the mindset for many years was concessions belonged at circuses and carnivals and not in movie houses or stage theaters. So concessions did not come into theaters until the 1940s. First, candy. Machines at the backs of lobbies, ushers hawking candy up and down the aisles. Popcorn came about 1945 or so. Of course, there was always a confectionery store, today we call it a party store, on the same side of the street as the theater. People were sneaking things in. They finally got smart and started salting the popcorn. And then you developed a thirst quench. So by 1950, Coca-Cola was introduced. So it took almost a decade for all of this to finally unravel itself and become a part of all theaters.
Then you need more restrooms.
Then you need more restrooms. And of course, you can't live without the revenue from concessions. So this actually leads up into what was then the ladies' powder room. And this was a room where women would come in, strictly powder their nose, and then go back into the theater. This is a later shot, but earlier there were actually little vanity tables all the way around this room with little mirrors and stuff. At some point, then it all became, keep in mind the rest of the theater's Italian Renaissance. This area was all Asian. Asian tapestries on the walls, Asian light fixtures, pagodas on tops of the mirrors. This was the gentleman's smoking lounge, which was right under the grand staircase. For a number of years, you could smoke. There are ashtrays and there are spittoons on the floor for those that chew tobacco. And this is really interesting too. Now, this was completely underwater when we acquired the theater. So once we got the water down, then we could start renovating this room. This whole fireplace is all plaster. You touched it and the whole thing would fall apart. The beams in the ceiling look like wood. It's all plaster. These are the types of crowds, for movies for many, many years. This is on Broadway. And of course, another reason this theater was so successful too, streetcar tracks. Right up the middle of Broadway, we had two streetcar lines stopped right at our front door. And of course, you can see the Wurlitzer building, which today has been completely renovated and is the Siren Hotel. And then the Metropolitan building to the left of it, which is the Element by Marriott Hotel today. And this is the lobby off of Broadway. This whole lobby was restored 2 years after we reopened in 1996. 1996, we did not have the funding to do this lobby. And then we received a grant from Ford Motor Company Fund in 1998 to completely restore this lobby, restore the plaster, do the decorative painting. That chandelier had been stolen. Ford found a really nice chandelier for us at the Henry Ford Museum. We restored that backstage, and that's on a permanent loan to us. Then in 2001, Ford came back and said, hey, we'd like to start having some stockholders meetings, at the theater. However, in that lobby, we'd like to replace these attraction boards with some painted angels. And there's enough neoclassical plaster in this lobby. Let's, on the other side here, let's paint some more angels. And by the way, the concession area really doesn't work. We're gonna come down, we're gonna send some guys down and help build a bar that's actually contoured to the floor of this room. So we were able to get quite a bit out of that grant. This is during the Paramount era, which they went all out with the fancy marquee, a band. This was all for the premiere of this Norma Shearer movie called Free Soul. And then they also changed the Blade sign to Paramount. And this is in the 40s here. This is a pair of Warner Brothers pictures. Folks lined up. Now, for a number of years, we were a United Detroit house. United Detroit Theaters was really the powerhouse chain in town. They had most of the downtown theaters. They were the ones that opened up most of the suburban theaters. They had the Birmingham Theater. They had the Royal Oak Theater, the Redford Theater, the Ramona Theater, the Alger. These are our usherettes from the 1940s. You have to remember, also during World War II, there was a shortage of labor because so many men were, had joined the war effort. And so we were also one of the first theaters to not only have an entire usherette crew, but we were one of the first theaters to have a female manager and also a female projectionist.
Mike, can you go back for a second? Is that General MacArthur on the side of the middle? That is a
Keep them fighting. I can't
map,
remember.
I think it says, yeah. All right. Thank you.
These are folks lined up on a Sunday. For many years, we also hosted WXYZ's Radio Schoolhouse of the Air, which was a live talent showcase every Sunday, similar to The Voice or America's Got Talent. Here's some folks, this is for a WXYZ radio program. This was, for a number of years also, there was a program called the Salute to Women Who Work. Women of all different types of professions and fashion shows and things like that, they would take over the theater for a whole day just to promote. Here's the Lone Ranger. A lot of people forget that, radio, initially a radio program, later on television. Of course, that and several other programs, came from studios in the old
Maccabees.
before Maccabees, they were in the Stroh building, which became Michigan Mutual building on Grand Circus Park. Studios in that building.
Is that where you speak?
I think so. And United Detroit Theaters also had screening room up on the 16th floor of this building as well. This is very non-PC by today's standards, but Uncle Tom's Cabin had they kept bringing this thing back. It was Raymond Massey did the voiceover, but it was done many, many years ago, and then they added more footage to it. And this thing kicked around well into the 1980s. Sal Mineo did more openings at our theater. I think he did 6 big premieres at our theater. Now, we're going to talk about this later on. This was the world's premiere of The Tingler in 1959, complete with a street party right out on Broadway. And United Detroit Theaters operated this theater up until the early 60s, and then Nick George took it over for several years. Nicholas George Theaters. Nick was a Greek immigrant who came to town. The Allen Park Theater was his first theater, and then he just kept the Maikai Theater, the Americana. He eventually sold out to AMC. In 1966, then community theaters, the Goldberg family took over the theater and operated it right until 1978. These were the last movies to screen at the Grand Circus Theater. A Naked Rider, At Last at Last, and Jailbait Babysitter.
Real first.
Yeah, socially redeeming. And today they're rated PG, and they're on DVD. But it was costing, a minimum $5,000 a week just to keep the doors open. And even with porn, $2,500 a week just wasn't cutting it. And you have to understand, in this business, in the movie business, for many, many years, you had to come downtown to see a first-run movie. It would take weeks or months for a film to go to the neighborhood houses. But by the 1960s, really starting with the Fox really was the first one to really start playing exploitation films. The studios were going where where the population was going, and that was to suburban theaters. So it's very difficult for the downtown theaters to get good first-run product. So we all survived the Fox the longest into the 1980s by showing, horror, gore, kung fu, and softcore porn. There's another Chuck Turner played for a long time. The World of Susie Wong, this was in 1960. United Detroit Theaters decided to do a 6-figure renovation of the theater. This was another world premiere with McHale's Navy. Even in the 60s, the theater still looked really cool. This was an art project on a number of buildings downtown on the side of our theater. This is what, back in the old days, what the backstage looked like, the lake board. And then, 78 to 80, the theater was mothballed. From 80 to 85, it was a rock concert theater. So everybody from Grace Jones to the B-52s to Psychedelic Furs to you name it, even early Bon Jovi was here. The very first Metro Giants Detroit Music Awards were at the theater. This was the first group that won an award, the Platinum Riders. And the theater still, at the beginning of the early 80s wasn't too bad. This was a main floor concession stand. You could start to see, plaster damage. This was we had the second biggest screen in town after the Fox, 54 feet wide. And we could screen everything, 35 millimeter, 70 millimeter. These were the seats that were put in the late 1950s. And the box level, 17 boxes just like there are today. And you can see plaster damage starting to appear in the ceiling. This is the big oval. This was originally ringed with 3,000 pink, yellow, and blue bulbs to signify the sky. Here we go. There's a flyer I found in the theater for the Plasmatics, B-52s, who are on their final tour this year. Plaster damage in the ceiling. And of course, boarded up after 1985. This is what the balcony looked like when we acquired the theater. So from 81 to 85, 4 years of snow, rain, and ice coming in the building because the rock promoters, when they left the theater, they had poked holes in the roof hoping to put a rooftop restaurant up there, and it never happened. Ironically, they were in the 1921 plans, but never carried out. And we also had people living in the building for those 4 years. Bombs, tons of trash, lots of animals. This is the box level.
It's amazing that it came back.
After this, I never say no. The same with the Gem Theater too. The Gem was in pretty bad shape like this as well.
Did you see the inside of the train station?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is what the office building was like, just as bad. This was actually the library for Walsh College of Business up on the 6th floor. And then our board at the time too, you know, opera houses don't have marquees. So unfortunately the marquee had to go and it was replaced with a big canopy. I mean, I'm really trying to do a marquee. Again, I have to raise $1 million to do it. When that marquee came down though, guess what we found? The original Paramount logo and the Publix logo. Publix was their theater arm. And we took down walls in the Madison lobby and found more hand-painted signs for when it was at United Detroit House. And this one promoted two great hits while they are new, which was a policy across the street at the Madison Theater. Interestingly, too, for a number of years, there were two tunnels connecting our theater with the Madison Theater. We shared a steam tunnel with that theater, and then the other tunnel, we shared the same orchestra. And so the musicians never had to deal with inclement weather or deal with crowds. This is a picture I took when I went up on the roof, because we had people living even up on the roof. Shopping cart, you know, lawn chair. Hudson's was still standing too. And this was one of many hard hat tours that we gave. I mean, this was a project that nobody believed in initially. Everybody thought Dr. DeCare was absolutely nuts for taking on this project. It was very difficult to get funding. I think we did about 50 tours to major corporations and foundations before it finally started to sink in that they might be able to pull this off. There's Dr. DeCare talking to another group. And we did all sorts of things just to get people in the building so they could see what could happen. We brought in people from around the country to show, you know, funders what could happen to the theater. And then in '94, before we began full-scale restoration, we did our annual benefit, the opera ball, in the building to really drive home the point, you know, and also raise some funding that night. And a Ford was a part of that too. Probably see a Mustang back there that we auctioned off that night. But it was a challenge because there were no restrooms, so the entire property was ringed with porta-johns. We had to bring in generators for the light that you see here. The orchestra pit was still drying out, so the band had to be propped up. And of course, all these folks enjoying dinner and beverages with falling plaster. So.
Lead-based paint in your meal then.
And besides the lead-based paint, an asbestos curtain hanging. And then we opened up for several months with some shows from Theater Grotesco, which was, you know, off Broadway type shows. And we could only see people on the box level, and we had to have somebody from the fire department on site all the time. And this is what up on the 4th level looked like. This all had to be completely redone. Cracks and plaster. Chandeliers missing, you know, crystals. Gaping holes. This is on the 3rd level. Just a tremendous amount of plaster damage. You can see some of the original 1922 I-beams. All of the mirrors, of course, were smashed. And then we opened up. This is where the movie screen would have been. Looking, you can see the old Hilton Hotel there. There's where the movie screen was. Here's where one of the office buildings was. And all the footings going in to expand the stage. The stage was only 26 feet deep, and we needed a much deeper stage for large-scale opera, dance, and Broadway. So you can see how we this newer part is 75,000 square foot addition. And this is putting that Broadway lobby back together again. And this is the Storm lobby on Broadway. And there's Chris. Had a little press conference for the media on how we were creating all of this plaster. This is actually one of those medallions. You have to remember that all of this plaster in 1922 was adhered with horsehair. And so we had to make sure that all of this plaster was the same thickness, for sound. So we had plaster shops created. We set them up in the middle of the auditorium, and then where our cafe is today. We called these the bakeries. And then everything went back into the auditorium. There was a pulley system on both sides of the auditorium, and then everything went back in place by hand.
So that's part of your 7 stories of scaffolding then?
Yeah, and these are all the little pieces, intricate pieces that had to be created as well. And then we had 22 different artists recreate all the murals in the lobby, because most of those murals were damaged from water and dry rot. These were all Ukrainian artists. This is putting in the seats. The seats were all made at Country Roads up near Grand Rapids, which is now part of Irwin Seating. Also, we're in the Motor City, right? So all of our seats are thicker than most theater seats. And we did not use traditional upholstery. We used automotive upholstery. And this was a collaboration between Lear Seating and Cadillac.
Are you saying we need bigger seats in Detroit than we
These seats obviously are bigger than the ones when the theater opened.
They're better, Mike.
And we weren't even done yet trying to get open, and all the sets, of course, arrived for La Boheme, which was the first production to arrive and reopen the theater. Over 300 men and women were a part of the team to bring this theater back to life. And of course, we still, even when we opened, we weren't done with everything, decorative painting, wallpaper, things like that. We didn't have an elevator for opening day. We didn't have air conditioning for opening day. We did have paparazzi, though, to get the place open. And Joan Sutherland. And Bohème was the first production on stage, and we reopened. And this is a later production. This is everything coming along. This was the last big grant we received from retail. Because, Hudson's was a part of us for so long, and even when it became Marshall Fields was incredibly supportive of all the arts organizations. We worked with Steve Seabaum, who has a studio up in the Traverse City area. He did over 850 tests throughout the facility, so we could get back to the original color palette of the blues, greens, golds, and dusty rose colors. That's the lobby. These are all the murals that we had to redo. The railings. Rosettes are everywhere. They're in ceilings, they're in plaster, they're in cast iron. And this is there are crests too, the Capitol crest all over these railings as well. We have recarpeted twice since we reopened, and that's actually part of the original pattern that we found in the upper balcony. Here's the stage. There's all the new 25 panels around the proscenium. And then we added 89 line sets on the stage so that each of these lines controls lighting, scrims, draperies, scenery. And then the orchestra pit. The original pit held 40 musicians. This new pit holds 100 musicians. The whole front is on an elevator. It can break into 2 different sections. And then we purposely put a dock in so we can keep 2 semis at the house all the time, especially for the traveling Broadway shows. And that's the restored box level. This is the lobby on the 3rd level on the Broadway side. This gentleman came to us from Bulgaria. He's also a teacher at CCS. And there was no way that he was going to do frescoes. He was not going to do anything on canvas and have it applied to the wall because that was not the way he was taught. So he came in for a year, cleaned all of this, put a sort of a neutral background on it, then hand drew everything in the ceiling, and then spent the rest of the year on scaffolding painting. And that lobby features images from famous operas, dance, and composers.
What does he teach at College for Creative Studies?
I don't know if he's still there, but it was, a number of things. And then he had one helper she did nothing but the gold. So. And this is the side of the building I told you about that went away for almost 2 years. All of this terracotta that was damaged. And then tackling the office building, we actually saved some of the ribbed glass from the architect's offices, and we've used that on the 5th floor. And then we put in a donor lounge on the 2nd level facing Comerica Park. Sort of our way of competing with skyboxes at the stadiums across the street. So anybody who contributes $2,500 a year or more to the opera company or to the theater, this becomes their lounge. It includes complimentary valet parking. You have your own usher team up here, nicely planted restrooms. You can pre-order food and beverage in advance. Everything's lined up along the ledges alphabetically. Gives you more time to hang with your peeps during intermission. And then we put a cafe in on the main floor in some of the former retail space. These were actually light fixtures that were saved from a Masonic temple that was being demolished in Toledo.
And who, was there a corporate sponsor for that?
A corporate sponsor? Am I allowed to say?
General Motors.
General Motors. You've got the Broadway lobby. And the Black Box Theater within the Ford Center for Arts and Culture, or Education, was funded by Chrysler, Stellantis. We are also the only opera company in North America that owns and operates its own parking garage. Now this took place in 2000 because our board of directors said, with Ford Field open now, with Comerica Park open, if you don't do something about parking, you're not going to survive. So we bought the old Hudson's Shoppers Garage on Broadway. If any of you remember, that was 2 garages sort of melded together, a 1939 garage and a 1960 garage, with the old round you go, tiny claustrophobic elevators. So we bought that, demolished it, put up a 780-car garage, and then put an office building in front of that. We have 3 tenants in there, and that, is a revenue stream for us. And let me tell you, during the pandemic, this literally saved us. So we had to raise another $15 million to construct the garage. Thus far, to bring 2 whole blocks back to life on Broadway and downtown, roughly $60 million to restore the theater, restore the 2 office buildings, build the garage. And we've had a lot of fun with the building too. This was during the All-Star game. This is when Walsh College of Business had the entire 5th and 6th floors. And like I said, they were the longest tenant in the building from 1922 to 1970. Then they moved to Troy.
Women students?
Hmm?
Women students?
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Yeah. And most of the classes for many years were nighttime only. I mean, they packed a lot of students into these small rooms with small desks. And Jules Shabbat Jewelry, of course, was founded in our building. So was Greenstones. And Sidney Granville. And First by Robert, which had a store right on Kirchdale, right across from where Trader Joe's is there in the corner.
In the village.
Okay, I brought a couple of things here too besides that. This is what a typical template looks like when you're recreating seats. So we were faithful, these were the original, this looked very much like the original seat standards. And of course, again, we've tried to work with as many Michigan-based companies as possible. This is that original exit plate, so I'm sure this is all stained glass. And then, now the marquee too. The marquees years ago were challenges before plastic letters came into. The letters that would go up were metal like this, and then you had to line them all up. So that could be challenging for.
Now, are these from your collection or from the theaters?
These are from the theater. But,
I'm close.
yeah. And then, now, we have a special guest with us tonight who wants to talk about, because he attended the premiere of The Tingler. This was what, 1959?
Does anybody have questions? Well, let's go ahead and talk.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll do the
We'll
questions.
follow
after.
that.
Go ahead, please.
The Tingler was a masterpiece of marketing. And as Mr. Hauser said, the movie came out in 1959. And they led off with ads in the paper saying the world premiere of this new movie, The Tingler, would be in Detroit. And it would be the scariest movie ever made. And then they followed that up a short time later with ads in the papers that said that if you went down to the Kearns department store and saw a man wearing a bow tie, and if you went up to him and said, "You're the Tingler," and shook his hand, he would give you 2 free tickets to the premiere. So naturally, the place was jammed with kids running around to that. Any man who wore a bow tie that day was miserable. Anyway, I lucked out, and me and my buddies found him, and they got him before he started saying no. So anyway, we got 4 free tickets. And another thing that they did is they had a Tingler's Ball on the Broadway side, under the marquee. And if you had an acceptably scary enough costume, you also got two free seats for the premiere. And there were some amazing costumes that some of these people came up with. And they had the whole 9 yards with aerial searchlights, and had part of the street blocked off. And although he was there, I heard, I didn't see him because I wanted to get in and get a seat as early as possible, so I didn't see Vincent Price. But once you walked into the theater, there'd be an attendant before you got to the seats. They were passing out white pieces of paper you open up. It was an insurance policy from Lloyd's of London, guaranteeing you $100,000 if you died of fright during the movie. and then we go into the movie, and one of the things, these people were really creative. They had paid fainters in the movie. So the very scary scenes in the movie, they'd stand up, one fall out into the aisle, and then have 2 guys dressed up like ambulance attendants run down with a sweatshirt, a stretcher and load people out and run back up. And the most infamous thing they did was they wired I think it was every other row of the seats with electricity. The idea was supposed to send a little tingle up your spine, but it didn't. It was like a cheap motel vibrating. But it was absolutely hilarious. But in the movie, you quickly caught on this movie was so campy. It was absolutely hilarious to be there. And to this day, it's one of my favorite movies. Matter of fact, it was just on, I think, a night or two ago, and I didn't catch it in time. But anyway, if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Do you mind me asking, how old were you in 1959?
I was 16.
So you grew up
Because
down
I used one of my 2 tickets for my sister, older sister, because she had a driver's license and she'd drive us all down.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We also did the premiere of William Castle's 13 Ghosts, which was really popular too, you know. But the marketing back then, you know, it's sizzling, it's sensuous, it's shocking, it'll tear the screams right out of your throat.
Questions for Mike?
How long have you been with the Opera House?
Well, I started as a volunteer when David got the building in '89, doing a lot of cleanup work, and then working on the Capitol campaign as a volunteer, doing tours and things like that. And then when they opened, they did not have ushers, didn't have an usher team. They were borrowing ushers from the palace. And so I started training ushers so we could at least get, you know, a small team going, people that would know the building. So, and then in 2000, I was asked to join the community programs department. And then the gentleman who had been the marketing director left in, I think that year also. So knowing my marketing background, they asked me if I wanted to come to the marketing department, so I did.
Very nice.
So, but it takes a village, as you know, in terms of volunteers. Pre-COVID, we had 800 volunteers. You know, ushers helping out in the office, picking artists up at the airport, getting them to their hotel, doing a meet and greet for them, helping sell merchandise during shows. Now we're down to about 350 trying to rebuild. So, but without volunteers, you know, you simply could not function.
I'm just curious, you talk about having to redo the plaster work on the Broadway side of the building.
Oh, the terracotta?
The terracotta. You talk about finding carpeting to match the original carpeting. You talk about finding these plasters from England. So these are a lot of very unique, intelligent people. How do you go about even finding these people?
Well, today, you know, back then it wasn't so bad. You know, Detroit has always had a great group of artisans, you know, to put buildings back together again. Today, especially with plaster, it's really difficult today. There's a band of people that end up on all the same projects, basically. We worked with a lot of, you know, historic consultants, you know, who knew, like, Albert Kahn Collaborative was in charge of the historic part of the building, and then James P. Ryan Architects was in charge of building the new stagehouse. So you come in contact with a lot of people too. Plus we were fortunate to work with some folks who had also done some of this at Playhouse Square in Cleveland, where they restored, you know, 5 major theaters in their downtown. So it's the whole historic preservation movement. I mean, it's a small band of people, and we all keep in contact with each other.
Do you know if there's any Broadway pottery in the building?
No, they're in the fire. Everybody thinks that the fireplace in what was the ladies' lounge is Broadway, but it's not.
So you showed a picture of that Bulgarian artist who drew the frescoes. Where is that area?
That's on the 3rd floor on the Broadway Street side of the theater. It's an oval lobby.
Is
There
it
are
a
two
lobby
oval
and-
lobbies on that floor.
Okay.
Yeah, obviously, the architect loved to work with ovals, which is why we
Yeah,
got
that
a
may-
big oval in the auditorium that today we call it our Fabergé A.
And what is the ladies' lounge now?
It's basic, we call it the ante room, because you're leaving Italian Renaissance and going into a little bit Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, a little bit of deco. Now that area with that door lounge was another gift from some of the folks that built Somerset that reflects their personal taste. And of course, anytime somebody wants to give you a gift like that, you're gonna say yes, You know, regardless of.
What they do with
I thought that Bob Dewar had a lot to do with the restoration.
Yeah, he was our chairman of the board at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Dewar was
Chairman
also
Kmart.
chairman of Kmart Corporation.
I've always admired you guys had a famous costume designer in Hollywood. And I'm wondering at the Opera House, when did they incorporate the costume designers to work, with the.
Okay, again, thanks to two more donors. Costume shops at older theaters typically are in filthy attics or damp basements. And these folks wanted the costume shop to be in a more accessible area of the building, to have natural light, to have a comfortable floor. Again, the floor, recycled tires, nice and soft, because they're on their feet a lot, cutting patterns, working with fabric and things like that. So the costume shop is on the third level of the Broadway Street side of the theater, and that feeds right into the rehearsal hall, which is on that floor also. Rehearsal is like 50 feet above the back of the stage. So the costuming, we have between 6 and 8 people during the season. If we're creating a new production, then we'll ramp up to maybe 12 people. But it's not often that we will create something, fresh, brand new, all new sets, all new costumes. It's horribly expensive. We have to go out to the community, raise a couple $1 million to be able to do it. And the last time we did that, it was last year. It started long before that. The Life and Times of Malcolm X. And the only reason is because we were able to share that with, it's in Omaha right now, then it goes to Seattle, then to Chicago, and then to New York. So we're a regional company, so we work with people like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Miami. We share sets, we share costumes, so we can get that cost down to several $100,000 rather than millions of dollars. So we do 5 grand operas each year. We usually do at least bring in 6 of the major dance companies, and then we have a long-term agreement with Broadway in Detroit to do up to 25 weeks a year of the larger scale Broadway shows like the Wickeds and the Lion Kings and the Aladdins, and Frozen will be coming next year and that sort of thing.
I imagine Yuval and Christine have really energized everybody at the Opera House.
Yeah, and that all started, of course, with the pandemic, with
Right.
the show we did in the parking garage.
Right, yeah.
And then we did a show at a Meadowbrook,
Right. And then the garage, the other garage.
and the old Michigan Theater.
Right, yeah,
We did a show last November.
right,
It was sort of a pay what you can.
right,
And the show was on from 12 noon to 12 midnight.
right.
And by the time it got dark, then the entire show was done by candlelight. And then we relit that theater also, and then we took the whole 3rd floor of the office building, and those were dressing rooms and green room
Right.
and that sort of thing. And then I think I did about 30 or 40 blow-ups of what the Michigan Theater looked like. We had an area on the main floor where people came in, because we had so many young people and people who'd never been there before. They had no idea the history of the building. That was a lot of fun. And we've had so many requests to do something similar like that in the future. We had looked at other buildings downtown. We looked at where Silver's used to be, the old People's Bank building, but parking would have been a real issue. on that part of downtown. Also, our community shows we've been doing in different historic buildings too. Right now they were doing 6 shows at Christchurch Cranbrook. We've done a couple of smaller things at the Players Club on East Jefferson. So,
That players program was great.
How many productions have you been in?
I've never been in any.
You've never
I've
been an
never-
actor in any of
I
them?
no. I don't have a good voice for that sort of thing
That
either.
is super.
So,
What about you, Giles?
How many have I should have counted that before I came. I don't remember. 4, 5?
Our manager has a fabulous voice. I'll post it on YouTube.
no, my job is marketing, so my job is to get butts and seats. So, all sorts of, anything, radio, television, print, digital. I grew up loving movies, and so lots of times whenever we can partner, there's, say, a movie's coming out that relates to something we're doing. Like this past Monday night, we did a screening of Kate Blanchett's new movie, Tar, which is all about the orchestra world and power. So we did that at the Maple. We've done a lot of screenings at the Maple to tie in with some of our productions, and that's a lot of fun.
Well, Mike's gonna be signing books, but one last thing. Pavarotti, the story of him coming back. Didn't you have a story about he met the doctor and didn't he do something and then he said he would come back?
Well, we had brought him to town for a benefit at Joe Louis Arena and convinced him to come over to take a look at the project. And of course, he wanted to go on stage, and Dr. Dieter said, oh, yeah, you really don't want to do that. Oh, but I insist. No, Mr. Pavarotti, you can't go on the stage. To be delicate, it won't support you. Because the wood was all warped and, water everywhere. You can't do it. So, but then he took a look around and, tested it with his pipes. And he said, if you restore, I'll return. And of course he did. And then we also had him in 2001 for an Aida recital before it premiered at the Met. And then we brought him back again in 2003, I think it was the last time, for a benefit at the Palace. However, that evening also was challenging, shall we say. He wasn't feeling well. Do I really have to go on? Well, you've got all these people that have paid a tremendous amount of money to see you. Well, and the Palace also didn't really have a piano to his liking. So Dr. Kikir, of course, who used to be, when he first moved here, he was head of music at Oakland University. So we call over to Oakland University and say, can we please borrow a piano for the evening? So we had a grand piano, put on a flatbed with a police escort to get it over to the Palace on time.
Wow.
I was talking to Ron and Mary Lamparter, and I think they hosted the ball that brought Pavarotti, maybe the '96 one, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So, but there's a lot of crazy stories like that. You wouldn't believe some of the things that take place.
One last question, and then we'll have Mike sign
I
books.
wanted to pay compliments to the Opera House for the young people. My granddaughter was in high school at the time, and the Flying Dutchman was the performance there. And they gave her the part, gave her the part of the sea captain's sweetheart. And the costume designers down there did such a fabulous job. I didn't even recognize when we went down to look at her. But what I wanted to say to everybody today is God bless the Detroit Opera House, because what they've done with the young people in performing arts is just wonderful.
Yeah, we have a community programs department, and we have summer classes each year. We have 2 kids courses also, which gives the kids an opportunity to be on stage. And then we have a resident artist program where every year we bring in 6 artists from around the country to learn with us, to do community shows, and then be cast in the main stage productions. So.
Well, the young man in the office gets off at 9:30. I have to have the keys turned in. We have 35 minutes. Okay.